It's wonderful for me to be here, I must say, not just in Riga, but in this extraordinary mountain of glass or castle of glass, and everything within it, from the wall of books that really only exists in another place that I know of, and that's the British Library in London, to these fantastic spaces that you have to congregate. This space is probably a bit too large for our needs today, but it's dictated by the fact that we have a video recording or simultaneous translation, some technical need. Normally we would sit closer together, and I hope you will get to see the image as well. I should say it's particularly exciting for me to be here because for a number of years I had the pleasure of being the Doktormutter of Gustav Strenger when he studied in London, and I read his fascinating chapters on the ways in which people in Livonia remembered the dead, from the most simple workers in Riga to the knights of the Teutonic Order, to the members of the cathedral, to aristocrats, to nuns, all different parts of that society, which he did with great sensitivity. And I think that that spirit of Riga as a place of diversity has remained in my mind from reading all of that, and was really reinforced today when I went to the book exhibition, the 1514 exhibition. And if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, there are 3 more days, isn't that right? 3 more days in which you can do it. It is a concept-driven exhibition. It's extremely, extremely interesting and really quite moving, so I recommend it very warmly. And I think once you've seen it, you will see why I say Riga as a place of diversity. And that is why I just thought in preparing a lecture for this event that Riga is an excellent place in which to try and think about what it is to be European. And of course, this library is a fantastic place, particularly to discuss it. And as you will see also in the exhibition, although it's about 1514, which means a lot in this place, it is actually, again, about the book in European history. So I'll speak today about being European through a very, very specific symbol, and that is the Virgin Mary. But I want to reflect more broadly on the issue of identities. Identities like the identities of people in this city, identities that are created through migration and conquest and conversion and wars and work. And they leave us with memories, and they leave us with tangible remains like the books that are kept in this library, with material objects and with the shape of the landscape, of course. So to be a European is perhaps to recognize certain images and symbols quite particularly, as we will see. But it is also to be aware of the histories of those symbols and the emotional charge that they carry. To be a European today is to be aware that symbols, a single symbol can carry very different meanings for different groups, for different peoples. So Europe is a state of mind, amongst other things. It is a disposition, I think, towards interaction within the frame of law and with mutual respect. Europe has always thrived, has always been at its best when it used and harnessed and recognized that diversity, that difference within itself. And it has most tragically suffered, I think, in those periods when difference was denied or was forced to go underground. So in this lecture, which I'm very, very much aware is part of a fantastic series that you've had, I've been able to access some of the previous lectures through the Videotēka and watch them, but I'm going to make my contribution through this rich, important, and as we heard, particularly today, overwhelming figure of the Virgin Mary, which I've had the pleasure and the challenge of studying for quite a few years. As you know, the Virgin Mary came to these parts, to the Baltic lands, as part of that process of conquest and conversion that was associated from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and a long process of integration into some sort of concept of Christian Europe. And the Virgin Mary played a very particular part in that, and therefore there is so much rich iconography surviving despite the Reformation and despite everything else in these parts, okay? And they'll be familiar to you. But just think at the same time of what's happening at the very other end of Europe. Think of the Iberian Peninsula, where Mary was also associated with conquest and conversion. But there, of course, it was the Reconquista, as it was called, as it were, reconquest, the Christianization of lands that had been Christian, that became Muslim for hundreds of years. So it's a process that begins in the 12th century and was completed in 1492. And that slide from a manuscript of the 13th century shows you how the Virgin Mary there as well was an image on the banners of the conquistadores, of those who went on this sort of holy crusade for conquest and conversion. And there, of course, as you see in this image, they're encountering Muslims, that is the sort of, well, they would consider them infidels, but at the time they would call them infidels, but they're encountering Muslims, those are their foes. And of course, to Muslims, the Virgin Mary is not unfamiliar, because Muslims, of course, respect the Virgin Mary, not as a saint, but as a figure of exemplary piety. And then the next chapter, we might say, happening over these centuries, another drama which unfolds in the 16th century, in the century of the exhibition of the books, in the century that the exhibition shows so well to be a period of the most extraordinary change, when that whole concept of Christendom as one unified space cracks down and breaks into many different forms of Christian life. So there again, the Virgin Mary is absolutely at the heart of what become really heated debate about the nature of religious belief, and is part of polemics that take place in words and in theological concepts, but also through the breaking of images, as you see over there, and through the silencing of devotions not only of monks and nuns through the dissolution of religious houses, but also the simple devotions of the porters and the carters of Riga, those very sort of modest people who speak the indigenous language, and who, of course, had their devotions in their well-known chapel in St. Peter's. So that's a new chapter of Mary in this European history unfolding, and at the very same time as some Europeans are rejecting Mary in the course of the Reformation, or very much cutting her size down into a much more modest role within the Christian world of Protestants, Mary also is becoming a global figure. After all, the 16th century sees the arrival of America in a very big way to parts of Africa, to the Americas, and spreading further east in Asia. To remind you, so that Mary becomes a beloved and central figure in Central and Southern America, like here, and of course in the East, as you see in this here Chinese Christian image of Mary. And we might say that that making of Mary into a global figure has never really stopped since. I can bring you many, many images. This is just one of course, nowadays, and given the much more sort of, rapid communication, any manifestation, any new manifestation within the history of the cult of Mary spreads very quickly, is available in every possible format. And if you just sort of, the things that you can buy, just the sort of items of clothing or items of decoration related to the cult of the Virgin Mary are really quite astonishing. So how did this whole embeddedness of the Virgin Mary in European culture come about? and what can we learn from it about what it might be to be European, what being European might be. So one of the most creative and formative areas of early Christian imagination in general was a process of writing and creation, which I sometimes call, like a number of other scholars, the filling in of the gaps. So if the very first phase of life of followers of Christ resulted in the writings that we call the Gospels, accounts of the life of Christ and his ministry, very soon afterwards, there is a process by which a lot of the questions that the Gospels simply do not answer, and that believers or those who are in polemic with the followers of Christ are posing, all these answers are needed. So, for example, already in the 2nd century, we have papyri which contain versions of Mary's life, because if you remember back to the Gospels, there isn't a tremendous amount about Mary's early life. Mary is there in order to support and shore up the genealogy and the early life of Christ himself. So that a lot of questions about Mary, who is this woman? Why was she chosen for this extraordinary task? What recommends her? How could she have been so very pure? All these questions, as it were, find their answer from the 2nd century on, in narratives that are composed in order exactly to give answers that are in keeping with the growing interest and the growing number of Christ followers, and ultimately, of course, Christianity comes out from its situation of persecution and marginality in the 4th century and becomes the religion of the empire. So already very early on, from the 2nd century on, texts are written that try to answer those questions. Yes, she came from a Jewish family, a very good Jewish family. Yes, her parents bore her in very unusual circumstances. They were old, and it wasn't through sexual contact. Yes, she was protected by her parents so that her feet never touched the dirty ground, and she only ate food given her by angels. And yes, she was destined to work in the temple, in the pure work of virgins, weaving the holy cloths for the work of the temple. Yes, she then, when she reached her maturity, was destined to live with that man who was much older. He was a widower with 2 children, a single parent, struggling to keep up, and therefore Mary was the perfect mother to these 2 orphans. Now, it may well be that some of these stories are not known to you from your own religious education, but you've definitely seen in the art that has survived from along the Christian tradition visual representations of, the moment of the conception of Mary as her parents meet in the Golden Gate, and so on. So very early on, we find then these narratives that fill in the important gaps in the life of Mary. But of course, once in the 4th century, Christianity is first allowed to flourish, and then it, of course, becomes, by the end of the 4th century, the official religion of the Roman Empire. The whole question of how to represent Mary, how to embed her in liturgy becomes, and how to embed her, of course, in the creed, in the official formulations that are now flowing from Constantinople as to what it is to believe, what it is to be an Orthodox Christian. All these mean that the cultural production around Mary is much, much more intense, and every artist, every poet who writes a devotional hymn, every person who is organizing liturgy has to think how to do this appropriately in the case of the Mother of God. And the answer was that Mary should be treated with imperial dignity. She is a majestic person, and very many of the very earliest images of Mary that have survived, and this is from the late 6th century, which is nowadays in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, show you that it's almost a courtly representation of Mary. Mary dressed like an imperial woman. Mary with her court of angels and saints around her. And this becomes the earliest way of thinking about Mary in the Mediterranean and in Europe itself. Just to show you another image that really this is from the 7th century, really conveys this sort of majesty and dignity of Mary in the earliest representations. And it fits very well with the type of textual production that we're finding around Mary. Like, for example, the very famous poem of the 7th century, which was composed, the Akathistos hymn, which was composed to thank Mary for protecting the city Constantinople, the great Christian capital, against the onslaught of the Avars. And so this image, I suggest to you, fits very well, this type of approach to her, and I shall just read out a bit in translation. To you, O leader in battle and defender, O Theotokos, I, your city, delivered from sufferings, ascribe hymns of victory and thanksgiving, since you are invincible in power. Free me from all kinds of dangers, that I may cry to you, hail, bride unwedded. So these images are the product of the courtly culture of Byzantium, and because this is the only Roman Empire around, and because for many centuries it is really the center of Christian thought and production, it is not surprising that in the rest of Europe, in Western Europe, where the decline of the Roman Empire, or the transformation of the Roman Empire, meant that a lot of the institutions of learning and of organization of public life suffered a real blow compared to the East, it means that there was a sort of cultural leadership and hegemony from the East, so that we find that even in Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, they seem to be following very much the lead from the East. So you see, for example, this Carolingian ivory, which shows you Mary very much like this sort of seated, majestic, victorious figure, or indeed in this here very famous Bible from the British Isles, again, something like that Eastern Mary still persists. But by the end of the first Christian millennium, European cultural traditions, which hitherto had been so indebted to the Eastern model, are becoming much more independent, and there's a whole new period, really, of historical, intense historical change that we witness. We see now this Christian commonwealth that had begun around the Mediterranean parts, of course, of what had been the Roman provinces, has reached Ireland in the west and is reaching Scandinavia in the north, and includes now Poland and Hungary and Bohemia, all converted and joining this sort of Christian European commonwealth in the 10th century. The period between 1000 and 1200 is a period of vast population growth, political expansion, commercial intensification, and internal pacification. These things are always relative. So this meant that intellectuals, from theologians to poets to lawyers, all became engaged in a process of understanding that change, understanding the new institutions that are being created around them in Europe, be it the papacy, the Reformed papacy, be it the new monastic orders, be it the dynastic kingdoms like England and Denmark and Bohemia and Poland. So this is a period that many have described as the period of the birth of Europe, or the rise of Europe. So maybe we don't want to be so fanciful, but definitely something very important is happening. So as I say, distinctive new practices and ideas are developing in Europe, and the area of life that we would call religion today is an area of life that really touches absolutely everything. It touches rulership, it touches trade, it touches family life, it touches marriage. Nothing is unrelated to ideas that are ideas about the religious order, about that have to pass a test of moral scrutiny. All types of interactions between peoples, in a way, are now being considered by theologians, by lawyers, all within a Christian framework. So by the beginning then of the second millennium, a European religious culture was shared very, very widely, and particularly amongst intellectuals and commentators of the day. This doesn't mean that everybody agreed with each other, but it does mean that there was a really flourishing field of debate and interaction. All ideas, rules, and images were crafted in universities, in cathedral schools, in courts, in order to promote the dignity, the applicability, and the reception of Christian ideas. And I suggest to you that Mary, the rise of the interest in Mary and the cult of Mary and ideas about her and representations of her form an absolutely fundamental part of that process indeed. So let us step back just for a moment. I'm not saying here that Mary wasn't known before the year 1000 to Europeans, of course not. But I would say that in the centuries of the early Middle Ages, when Christianity is brought to new peoples, this process of conversion that brings it to Central and Northern and Northwestern Europe, and ultimately will bring it, of course, to Northeastern Europe, where we are, is one where, of course, Christ is presented as a judge, the crucifixion as a form of triumph over death. But most cults and most local interest was actually experienced through very local preoccupation with local patrons, local saints, local martyrs. Think of Vitale in Ravenna, or Saint-Denis and Saint-Geneviève in Paris, or Adalbert in Prague, and so on. Most of the dedications of churches, and definitely of cathedrals, were to those important saints, often saints and martyrs who brought Christianity for the first time to those parts. So they're very local, they're very specific, they're much loved. So what is happening in this period after the year 1000, I think, is the creation of far more universal and widely shared perceptions and identifications through figures that are pan-Christian, like the Virgin Mary, okay? And like, of course, the cult of Christ himself, the suffering Christ. So that is not to say that, that local saints are not important anymore. Of course they are. But above them and alongside them, there is an important way in which the liturgical year, the calendar year, the Christian year is punctuated by feasts and by devotions that are shared by all Europeans, alongside what are local traditions indeed. And I think what's also very important is to acknowledge the role of monastic orders here, of monasteries, and this was already mentioned, I think, when my very first letter from the director who invited me to give this lecture, who said, let us think about institutions that connected Europeans like religious orders. And I think religious orders are really very important here, because that is where the ideas about Mary were first matured. Think about it. People who devote themselves to the religious life, people who devote themselves to fighting sin incessantly, people who are away from family and loved ones. Mary becomes the loving mother, the consoling mother in this constant struggle against sin. It is first within the monasteries of Europe between 1000 and 1200, and remember, this is a period of great creativity in religious life, with new religious orders being created. Just before the beginning of that period, the Order of Cluny. In the very last years of the 11th century, the Cistercian order, the Order of Cîteaux, which produced their manuscript, are experimenting with these ideas about Mary as a very special companion to the monk or the nun or the person dedicated to the religious life. I always tell myself that maybe this is the earliest example I can think of where you see something of the new style of Mary. This is from around the year 1000, the Goldene Madonna, for obvious reasons, from Essen, where there was a stift, there was a religious foundation for aristocratic women. And their production, I could have brought you a lot of other examples of crosses and religious jewelry, all of which really concentrating on Mary. Now you will see, we see there something of the traditional Mary of the first millennium. She is sitting down in an austere position. She has her son in her arms. She is gilt. But there's just a beginning of some sort of movement. There is just a beginning of some sort of relationship with the viewer and with the child itself. Also, very importantly, it's a figure in the round. You can actually walk around it and behold it, perhaps on processional occasions. So we see here the debt to the tradition. We may see here something new as well. And just remind you that the patronage of monasteries and institutions like this one in Essen offered prestige to those who founded them and attracted, particularly the new orders, attracted really committed and interested people. Not everybody was a perfect monk or nun, but what they did was constantly reflect. Yes, some did biblical work, but all did liturgical work and all prayed. So it's not surprising that in the 11th and 12th centuries we simply have an extraordinary amount of new production, new prayers to Mary, new liturgies to Mary, new reflections upon the life of Mary, indeed the feast of the conception of Mary being born in English monasteries in the 12th century and being actually very controversial at its beginning. So that new ideas about Mary, like this idea, this is a later image, but it is an image of a new way of thinking of Mary that is born within Cistercian circles in the 12th century. It's Mater Misericordiae, Mother of Mercy, Mary like a protector of all estates of people under her mantle, protecting them. And that is exactly how Mary comes to be seen in great detail, the protector of those who are devoted to her. And from the Cistercian order, probably, one of the most famous medieval thinkers, of course, will be known to many of you, Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote some of the most moving lines about her. He wrote a fantastic commentary on the Magnificat, Mary's great song of praise. And just to give you a sense of the way he is writing about her here in English translation, Our Lady, our mediatrix, she who mediates, our advocate, to your Son reconcile us, to your Son commend us, to your Son present us. Obtain, O Blessed Lady, by the grace found in you, by the privilege deserved by you, by the mercy born of you, that he who by your mediation deign to share our infirmity and our misery may, by your intercession, let us also share his glory and his blessedness. He, Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, blessed above all, forever and ever. What's very striking is that Mary increasingly occupies the space of mediation. Christ is too scary. Christ on the cross to Europe that is better educated now in its religious duties is a very scary thing, the ultimate judge. Maybe the mediating mother is a helper. In her humanity, she will understand humans. She will listen. She will explain. And then some theologians argue, and of course, no son can ever refuse his mother. Well, that's something that my son has definitely never heard, but they argue because they share the same flesh, if she prays for you, if she intercedes for you, her son cannot say no to his mother. So these are the sort of ideas that are circulating. And let me also share with you the ways in which thinking about Mary, about fertility, about her pure body can inspire in particular the devotions of religious women. And I'm sure that many of you know the works of the incomparable, extraordinary Hildegard of Bingen, who was a nun in the Rhineland in the 12th century. She died in 1179, and she wrote as abbess for her nuns these extraordinary antiphons, hymns about the Virgin Mary. And in her writing in particular, she emphasizes Mary's body as the place of the incarnation, this extraordinary place. And being such a great musician, Ave Generosa, you can look it up on YouTube or have your own CD. But just to mention there, what's extremely interesting, that being a musician, Hildegard describes the incarnation in Mary's womb as a symphony, And she lists symphonia, it's the highest C in this hymn. So there's a real way in which liturgy, music, the theology of Mary, and this feminine sensibility are really bound together in this creative person. So love, mother love, maybe sibling love of sorts amongst monks and nuns were recreated through the cult of Mary in these institutions that are away from family, that away from the local vernacular, wherever you came from, the language in which people first learned both their religion and love in a family circle. In Latin now, a different world, but also infused in these consoling, I think, love creations around the Virgin Mary. And what was happening in the monasteries in the 11th and 12th centuries then absolutely shoots out in a very, very big way from the 13th, and particularly with the coming of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who made it their job to disseminate, to spread to the lay population in the local vernacular in very colorful ways, the sort of the messages that are being defined and refined by intellectuals and by spiritual writers. So we see throughout the 13th century this process throughout Europe of the implantation of the parish system. Every Christian belongs to a parish. In the parish, people are educated. But on top of that, there is also the additional preaching of the friars in cities, and there's preaching in every parish in the language of the people. And that language of the people, that local color, affects the representation of Mary too. So we might say that there's the Mary, the gilt Mary, the Mary in gold that is so typical to Tuscany. And then there is the Mary carved out of wood that is so common of the Auvergne. And there, this extraordinary Scandinavian Mary carved. You can literally see the shape of the tree trunk from which it was carved. So Mary everywhere and everywhere local in terms of the language that expresses her and the materials into which she is made. And most energy and thought and innovation is poured into making Mary domestic. Mary like the mother next door. Joseph was also incorporated into this story, as were eventually other relatives too. So there's a tremendous amount of investment in thinking about the Holy Family, which is now being taught in tens of thousands of parishes all over Europe, and including Livonia by the 13th century. So there is a tremendous investment in how to make this work for the laity, how to make this accessible, understandable, interesting, moving. And the story is one of making the Holy Family, making it a real family, making its experiences as domestic as can be. And so we see, far from being a figure of majesty surrounded by courts by the 13th century, like here, there is an emphasis on the simplicity and the literalness of the gospel story for some. This is obviously something that will be taken up in a very big way in the 16th century in Lutheran circles. But we also find, as we see in this here Parisian ivory from the 14th century, that there's a totally different relationship to the relationship between Mary and her son. They're looking at each other. They're touching each other indeed, they're kissing each other or something of the kind. Touching, kissing, sometimes aggressively grabbing the breast in order to suckle upon it. And it's not just Mary and her son, but there's Dad too. There's Joseph, this sort of benign older figure over there, sometimes sitting and watching the very close group of mother and son, sometimes participating actually in the activities, like here when Joseph at the fire is drying one of Jesus's diapers. Mary there taking her son to school for the first time. I'm just giving you an array of European images to show you the sense that it is cumulative and that this is happening everywhere. All forms of art, be it murals and carvings, and like here, this absolutely beautiful carving of the flight into Egypt, were used in this way. And it became really a feature of parish art to show this family in its daily life, in the very normal business as they go about doing what other families do. And I should add, it's less visual, more textual, so less pretty, but I should add that the texts are absolutely doing the same sort of things. Stories in the vernacular about, little goings-on in the family, sometimes Jesus being naughty and having to be corrected by his parents, Jesus who loved his mother's simple home cooking, and so on. And as if the nuclear family is not enough, there is a massive development of the cult of Anne, Mary's mother. This is not unrelated, of course, to the Immaculate Conception, the idea that Mary herself was conceived without sin, and therefore Anne comes into the picture as a very important part of the story of Mary's unique purity. Very often an image, again, I suppose you could have done something about Mary reading in your exhibition, Gustavs, but there's so much wonderful material. Anne here, as you see, teaching, she's there with the book. As her daughter has learned to read, now Jesus is learning to read, as you see on the left. But these images of tremendous tenderness and family affection, it also introduces to the whole picture an older woman, because Mary is always shown as young and beautiful, an older woman. And the image you see here is again a Scandinavian, a Finnish image indeed, on the left, the older Anne, on the right, Mary. And all different types of arrangements, as you see here, and there in the center, sometimes combining also alongside the child Jesus, also the child St. John the Baptist. And here, just to show you how much by the 15th century this has expanded, so that you have multiple generational and many many aspects of this family, because Anne was believed to have been married 3 times. So Jesus had all these cousins, as it were, from Mary's stepsisters. And this is not a gospel, but it's extremely important narratives that we see surviving from hundreds of parishes from Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, and of course in Catholic parts, very much a continuation into the early modern period, into that later period, like this here Italian example there, of this extended family around Jesus, just like around any other child. And I think that the artists were challenged, and they tried to show ways of, they were clearly experimenting, and they tried to show indeed how to show Jesus as human as anyone in their family nexus, without robbing him of dignity altogether. And there's a really interesting balance there. Of course, some theologians absolutely hated this whole movement and far preferred to keep Mary much more exalted, much more apart. So, this emphasis on love at the beginning of life, like here, that tenderness between young mother and child, of course, was never without the knowledge, never existed without the knowledge that there was an end to come, and that the end was very hard. And so we see, just as this process of domestication and humanization of Jesus and his family takes place, there is also a tremendous humanization and reflection upon the nature of mother and child, mother and son, at the end of his life, which of course was not an end, but was nonetheless understood in painful and tragic tones. And so we find around the year 1300, so throughout that 13th century, I should say, and here we see the wonderful image from Ducio's Maestà from the early 14th century, the image of the crucifixion has become a very, very busy place. It's become a place that is full of people. On the right, on your right, of course, the group of Jews and sometimes Roman soldiers. On the left, Mary and her relatives, and always the Apostle John, not the Apostle, the Evangelist John, comforting her as she faints in suffering and pain. And just to remind you, this was not always the case. This is how a crucifixion from the 12th, a crucifix from the 12th, this is a crucifixion scene from the 11th. So these tended to be in the first millennium of Christian art, very sparse, very contained, very minimal representations. And now, as you see here, it's a totally different story. It's a narrative of abuse, of suffering, very, very emotionally charged. And what we have born around the year 1300 is an image that you will all know, and that, of course, is the image of the Pietà, that is born in Europe at this moment. It is born as a separation, as a taking apart from the scene of the crucifixion of that moment, which has never been written, but can be imagined, when the mother is allowed to hold the body of her son who has been crucified, suffering in more or less graphic detail, like in this here, late 14th century Pietà, and the nexus in which it was developed. The first examples that we have of the Pietà are in fact from circles of religious women in the Low Countries, those who are known as begines, right? Women who were not nuns, just townswomen who often decided in widowhood or just to devote themselves to a religious life. And for their devotions, this was an important aid, concentrating the meditation on that moment of Mary and Jesus in the format of the Pietà. Well, of course, we all know this very famous version of it, known to people world round. And it's really quite striking how this, what we might say, this invented image of around 1300, this medieval invented image, became the quintessential European image of the mourning for suffering, for the loss of young men, often in war. Think of the use of pietas in various memorials of the First World War, like in tens of parishes throughout France and Flanders. Think of Käthe Kollwitz's extraordinary statue of a pietà of sorts, an every mother, a mother of any victim of war and violence in the Neue Wache in Berlin. So images change and images are multivalent. And to go back to that image there, of course, to remind us, as I mentioned a minute ago, that in these centuries increasingly the Jews come to the fore, the Jews of Europe come to the fore as figures that Christians really need in order to think about their own religion, meaning to say that one of the most fruitful ways, and in a way the most intellectually satisfying ways of defining Christian truth, is by defining it against the other, the Jew, the beliefs that the Jew rejects, the belief that the Jew derides, finds unreasonable. So we find from the 12th century on that there's a lot of writing, of polemics, of debates between a Jew and a Christian. Now, some of them we know took place in particular places in particular times. But some of them were also almost like a genre, a type that's a very useful way of clarifying Christian truth, particularly because the Jews are using, of course, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, according to Christians, in order to argue against. So there is a sort of intellectual logic, intellectual rhythm that is introduced here. So just to give you an example of the way in which one 12th century French bishop thought about the Virgin Mary by thinking of a Jew and what a Jew would say, I'll just read to you a bit. This is a tract about where he argues that Mary's body is pure against a Jew in whose mouths he has put the words that say that Mary's womb, like any woman's womb, is not a pure place. So he counters the Jew by saying, where is that which you call the uncleanliness of woman, the obscene prison, the fetid womb? Confess, you wretch, your stupidity. In his conception, the Virgin became the marriage bed of omnipotent God and the sanctuary of the Holy Spirit. What in all creation is more holy, more clean, more pure than the Virgin from whom was assumed what God became? O womb, O flesh, in whom and from whom the Creator was created and God was made incarnate. So this peculiar way in which the Jew gets inserted at the heart of Christian debate. And so it is as Mary becomes the quintessential figure of love, who suffers so badly at the foot of the cross, as we see over here, the Jew becomes the quintessential enemy of this now deeply human, everywhere to be seen Virgin Mary. You see that in the image there, but you also see it in other images too, like there's always this group on the other side of Jews that are pointing, that are deriding. It becomes one of the absolutely central ways of thinking about the crucifixion now. And remember that these images were not just images for decorating churches. They were associated with really important texts. And one area in which, in particular, there was a great deal of creativity in the vernacular is in Tuscany, in the Tuscan cities from the 13th century. It's extremely common for lay people, well-off lay people, to join confraternities, brotherhoods, groups where people spend time doing devotional work. And they're doing devotional work, in these cases, by chanting chants in the vernacular about Mary suffering at the foot of the cross, and very often suffering because of the Jews. And it's extremely moving because the language of Mary as she speaks to her son, although he's a grown man hanging on the cross, from the cross, is almost like baby talk, just as she had spoken to him when he was a baby. Just to give you an example. O figlio, 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 oi amoroso Giglio, figlio, chi dà consiglio al cor mio angustiato? O son, 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 O beloved jewel, son, who gives comfort to my anguished heart? And then Jesus in turn answers back, Mama, Mama, you pierce my heart. So these really moving exchanges with the Jew always as that enemy. And sometimes it's even more explicit, like in the case of the fraternity that met in Modena in the 14th century and describes the crucifixion. Down the white flesh, the red blood trickled. Behold the bitter life that Mary's son has had. The crazed crowd, the crowd of Jews, ordained in council death and destruction to the good pastor. So the love language of Mary and Jesus in these confraternities is, of course, a hate language around the Jews. So the love lessons taught by and through the figure of the Virgin Mary came at a price. They valued maternity and motherhood. They introduced a humanizing aspect to the practice of religion, which allowed people also to rediscover their own worlds of family and relationships, household and work. But they also created troubling traditions that deserve our consideration. Another such troubling tradition, I'm not sure where this is exactly leading, but it occurs to me, that as the cult of the Virgin Mary supported the efforts of celibate men, these men seem to have remained children forever, children within the cult of an unaging mother. Here we see an image that was made in the 1520s after the death of that abbot from the Diocese of Utrecht. He's a Carthusian abbot. And it strikes me here that when you look at Mary and her child and you look at this here abbot, he's dressed in white, just like the cloth that surrounds the child Jesus, but also his face without wrinkles, without any mark of age, almost like that of a child. What happened to these men? What happened to these celibate men as they concentrated their love on Mary without other hurdles of maturation? The emphasis on chaste maternity was set within a system of gender relations which were not fixed or uniform, but were nonetheless patriarchal in their concept. And that is why when we saw the household of Joseph and Mary, although Joseph is so marginal to Mary in the Christian story, nonetheless, as you saw, he was an active member of the household. And it's interesting that 20th century fascist regimes very often, be it in Italy or Spain or Portugal or Germany, use that image of the perfect maternity in order to enchant mothers, to make them enchanted, but also in order to keep them at home and hearth and nurture. So the language of love mediated by the Virgin Mary imagined cruel enemies, the Jews above all. And by the 16th century, these cruel enemies were, of course, Protestant. Those who rejected the claims made about and around the Virgin Mary, or many of them, were demonized and as enemies of the essence of humanity itself. In the case of Jews, of course, this could lead to different types of punishment and exclusion. But Protestants too, like Protestants, say, under Mary in 16th century England, suffered tremendously as well. So we began with the suggestion that any historical understanding of these symbols of love must also embrace the possibility of change and the possibility of multivalence, that a symbol of love to one is a symbol of pain and perhaps hate to another. And indeed, just to emphasize that in the 16th century, within the symbol of Mary could have resided so many different types of feelings. So there is the issue of continuity, because Martin Luther, of course, was very interested in the Virgin Mary. He wrote beautifully about the Magnificat, he wrote fantastic hymns. But it was the Mary cut down to size, the Mary of the gospel story. Her biblically based humanity, which he described in this way: she seeks no glory, but goes about her meals and her usual household duties, milking the cows, cooking the meals, washing pots and kettles, sweeping out the rooms, and performing the work of a maidservant or house mother in lowly and despised tasks. So not the Immaculate Mary of the Immaculate Conception. So Mary to Protestants was above all domestic and simple, and as we saw, there's a strong medieval tradition of that. A statue of Mary and Child, the Schöne Maria of Regensburg, was erected very early in the 16th century and associated with an accusation against Jews. Yet this shrine was on the list of sites singled out for destruction by Luther in the 1520s. So harmful did he judge their influence to be. Zwingli also cited the cult poem associated with the Schöne Maria as an example of all that was wrong with the church: pilgrimage, miracles, superstitions, images, and rabble-rousing by preachers. In Europe of religious diversity, because yes, religious diversity and even forms of tolerations did develop in the course of the 16th century, one finds interesting combinations. We find even pilgrimage sites that were visited by Catholics and Protestants alike, particularly in the Low Countries, sometimes in England. We sometimes observe an individual trying to contain the two traditions in one lifetime. I'm thinking of William Byrd, the Catholic music master and composer in a Protestant land, who first worked in cathedrals, but ultimately in the royal chapel of Elizabeth, the greatest symbol of Protestantism and a great persecutor of Catholics. He perhaps was able to do so because Elizabeth, for all her Protestantism, was one of the queens who most used and most explored the possibility of presenting herself as a virgin queen. And the continuities with some of the representations of Mary, I think, are obvious from this, her coronation portrait. So as Europeans, we travel and trade and relate to each other. We share histories and traumas. And in no year are we aware of this more than in this 2014, as we mark the anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. But we have also achieved a great deal in our ability to accept difference and even to celebrate it. Bound by principles that are universal in their ethics, we engage with the European heritage, much of it created in the Middle Ages, in the design of our cities, in the arts we cherish in our museums, in the music that we listen to, in the aesthetics that Europeans have developed and shared with the world, with the whole world. To be European is not to be all the same, but it could be a form of citizenship that accepts debate, acknowledges the weight of the past, the inspiration it offers, as well as the responsibility it imparts. The loving figure of the Virgin Mary may not have been the inspiration for the EU flag, as so many claim, but its quality to inspire both inner peace and violence, the figure of Mary, to inspire both consolation and inner peace and violence, should teach us how diverse our European legacies on this continent we inhabit, as well as beyond it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miri, for your great lecture on Mary, which is one, but at the same time there are many Marys. I hope that you have questions, at least some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you have a question in Latvian, I hope that Viktors will be able to translate it. We'll find ears to give to you if the question is in Latvian. So
you could translate as well.
Well, Viktors is much better than me.
That's probably true.
Questions? Questions?
About anything at all. Don't be shy.
Ilgais Nisans, kā viduslaiku baznīcai izdevās panākt to, ka dievmātes kults nevis konkurē ar Dievu dēlu kultu, bet to papildina?
Brilliant question, because a lot of people were very worried about exactly that. And some of the theologians disapproved of the innovations. Indeed, when the rosary as we know it, a system of meditations, is created in the 1460s and 70s by a number of Dominican thinkers, they make it absolutely clear that there has to be almost a discipline around it. Your Ave Marias and then a meditation on the crucifixion, so that there was a way in which this was absolutely understood. You're absolutely right. You see it in so many ways. You see it in altarpieces. In the 13th century, most altarpieces have Jesus in the middle, maybe the scenes of his childhood either side, which Mary can appear in, of course, as his mother. 14th, 15th centuries, you have many more altarpieces where Mary is the center, where Mary's life story, so much of it, as I said, not in the gospel, being developed and so on. So there is a real tension here. it maybe didn't achieve it, to repeat the terms of your question. This was definitely a tension there. There's no question at all. Whoops. Have I done something wrong? Okay, I'll just stay here, I won't move. So this is a tension, and some people didn't mind. Some people didn't mind at all, and they pursued it. But there were clearly voices that also thought that there needs to be more of this sort of discipline. Absolutely right. Thank you, it's a very good question.
Thank you.
And sorry, may I just continue to say that, of course, Luther, this is one of the things that he actually says, that, this is totally out of control, this whole business of all the Marian feasts and all the Marian pilgrimage and so on, that it detracts from what one really has to think about. So it fits in with your question, clearly.
Thank you. More questions? I will ask a question. What about Mary and sexuality? Can we see her as a tool of sublimation for people living in celibacy? And can you tell some examples, if there are, how Mary is seen as an ideal woman or sexual object? Does she at all has to do something with the sexuality, or yes, that's my question.
Well, I wouldn't use necessarily the term sublimation, because that belongs to a whole psychoanalytic discourse that we would have to go into in great detail. But what I was getting at in an image like this, for example, is to reflect upon the psychosexual world, the emotional world of somebody in that situation. I thought that combination is an extremely interesting one. I should also say that, so what I would say is that some of the images of Mary, not many, but some of them, particularly paintings that are made for very rich patrons, for very rich secular patrons, are truly extraordinarily disturbing, particularly in the treatment of the breast. I mean, the breast is a very, very complex symbol, of course. It's full of associations. You cannot separate out the breast. You can't separate out the function of nurture and the function of fascination and touch and smell and feeling around that. You have to take it as a rich site of human experience. And one, as a historian, I would like to follow the trails where I have the type of information that can reveal it. And I think I do have one such place. Unfortunately, I don't have the image here. But it's extremely interesting that about Bernard of Clairvaux, Bernard whom we heard already earlier this evening, 100 years after his death, a tradition develops within the Cistercian order that one day he was praying to Mary so wonderfully well that Mary took out her breast and squirted breast milk on him. It's called the lactatio, which is a very dignified Latin word to describe a quite extraordinary occurrence. So what is going on there? She's squirting milk at him. What does it represent? The breast being revealed. There are deep potentialities, and these are human situations. And the whole area of maternity and femininity, it's bound together. So it would be meaningless to give an answer yes or no. It is part of the richness that we have to unravel. Okay?
Yes, thank you. More questions? Yeah.
Hello. You didn't talk about schism in the church. So the images you used is mostly European, like Western tradition. So my question is more about in Eastern churches. Some were borrowed, some were shared images. But the whole family thing never was taken up by Eastern churches. What do you think? What's the divide after the schism? Why these images, an image of Mary is in a way very different in these both churches?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to explain not so much why Byzantines or why Syriacs, indeed. You can go further east into Asia. There are Christians living under Muslim rule in the Middle Ages. Different situation. So I would pose the question a different way. Not so much why didn't they go for it, but why did Europeans develop this particular version? And in my mind, I think it was related to this extraordinary spread of evangelization into parishes, into everywhere, reaching everywhere, and the particular bond between sacramental Christianity in a parish with the life cycle that was created so powerfully, I think, and successfully, I think, as well, in Europe. Now, that is not to say that there was no criticism. You know full well, I'm sure, that the Cathars found this abominable, absolutely abominable, that there were many voices of critique coming even in late medieval England against the excesses of Marian devotion and that it's inappropriate sometimes to express things in this way. So I would say that from very early on, indeed from the 4th century, some of the Eastern bishops, the Syrian bishops, who come to the Council of Nicaea, they don't even like what they hear over there. They don't even like this whole pulling down of Jesus in a mother and a womb and born of a virgin, etc. So that the drama is actually not just East-West, it's different versions that became authoritative. And as you know, then from the 4th century on, from Constantinople was emanated this literally orthodoxy, the correct route, which of course then translates itself not only ultimately to Russian Orthodoxy, but also has enormous influence in places like Bohemia and Poland as well. So that what we can find then, so I think what's very interesting in the Hungarian case, that you can almost see the enthusiasm for Mary with the conversion at the very end of the 10th century. It could be feeding off actually totally different traditions, and it's very interesting to examine them. And methodologically, one would say so that, okay, as kingdoms and peoples join the communion with Rome, so Mary becomes very important in particularly theological ways, but when they're going to build their churches or decorate them, they're going to be very much influenced by local tradition, local examples, and some of them may have more of the East in them than in other places. Does that make sense? So there isn't a teleology as to what Christianity has to become, at least as a historian. And in that sense, Europe chose a particular route in its deployment of parish, family, locality in service of this amazingly important figure, just like it developed the Eucharist in a totally different way from the East as well. Thank you, very good question, thank you. There was a question here, I believe.
Yeah, one last question.
Last question, oh dear.
Maybe if there will be
we were having fun.
Another chance.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. I'd like to ask you to give a small reflection why you see the Mary was very, very central person in development of religion, and I'm wondering why institutionally church developed in a very much in a masculine way.
In a masculine way.
Why there are not so much bigger role given for females?
Well, that's the big question. You do know that in the Anglican Church now, they voted last month for women bishops. I mean, I'm not a Christian, it's not my story, but it's quite interesting to see this evolve. Okay, so the question was, in case you didn't hear in the back, that we've got this whole thing of Mary, but actually the church was extremely strict about keeping women away from ministry and away from, obviously, sacramental action. That was more or less the question. Yes, I mean, it's not dissimilar to the previous question in terms of it poses really very fundamental questions about structure and about authority, doesn't it? And it's extremely telling. You make me think now that something I hadn't quite appreciated until now, although I was talking about the monasteries, I mean, in a way, you may think that the monasteries are sort of safe places within which to experiment with the authority of Mary. So if we go back to please allow me just a minute here to go back to, I know where I'm going. I just have to get there. That's it. No, that's it. No, that's it. So, Mary at the top, this abbot, handing the church that the monastery is just founded down there, this whole business, that's okay within a Cistercian monastery. That's okay amongst, in a structure that is, very clearly defined. You can explore the feminine in a sort of safe way. And in a way, I don't think Mary really, despite the excellent first question about Mary taking away from the energy around the devotion to Jesus himself, despite that question, it did not, on the whole, go into the direction of associating her with ministry and with, you might even say that Mary Magdalene was more treated as a preacher and possible, apostola apostolorum than Mary was, in an interesting way. So that this domestic area, this use of very traditional gender roles and the presentation of her, in humanizing her, was something that really wasn't so much a challenge to, but you might even say a support to what are traditional structures of the church. What I would say, though, that reality is far more interesting usually. So what you get, for example, the most important one, the great Feast of Corpus Christi, to which I devoted a whole book, which was founded in 1264, so we're just celebrating the 750th anniversary, although it was founded by a pope and followed theological discussion, actually emerged out of a vision that a beguine from the Low Countries had, who was a great Mary. I mean, so there are ways in which the influence did travel, good, influence and good ideas do travel, coming from women or men, but the structures were very, very definite. And yet, at the same time, everybody agreed that religious education starts at home with the mother, up to the age of reason, and then it's handed over to the parish priest. So there was a sort of division of labor, a sort of accommodation, but you're absolutely right that on the issue of sacramental authority, there was unanimity.
Thanks. Last question.
Jaunajos laikos reformācijas procesiem rītot. Viena no apsūdzībām katoļiem bija tā, ka Marija faktiski veido četrvienību. Šodien arī, piemēram, Dominikāņu ordenis Baltijai, Polijai, vēl dažiem reģioniem, kur mariānisma kults ir augstā līmenī, izvirza tieši tādu pašu apsūdzību. Piemēram, pat mūsu kardināla Pujata apstiprinātā dziesmu grāmatā ir virkne dziesmu, kuras ir aizliegts dziedāt Latvijas katoļu baznīcās, jo Dominikāņu ordenis noprotestēja tekstu, piemēram, jā, Marija aizlūdz pie dēla, bet viņa nevalda, viņa nav valdniece. Vai tā ir zināmā mērā atgriešanās Eiropā šur tur reliģiski arī pie šīm vecajām viduslaiku domāšanām, šis mariānismu kulta uzplaukums tieši tagad?
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know about the second half of your question with this. That's extremely interesting. I'm going to have to ask Gustavs more about it later. But that's really interesting. But what I would say about the quaternity is that there developed in the 14th and 15th centuries a certain way of presenting, I have a lovely picture at home, but presenting the Trinity as dwelling. So, okay, you take a statue of Mary, you open it up, and inside you put the Trinity. So what you get is a quaternity, and it's even more shocking because it's as if Mary is the sort of primum mobile, Mary was there and they were born out of her. And there is a very interesting text by Jean Gerson, who's the very great theologian of the early 15th century, when he describes that one day he went to the Church of the Carmelites. Of course, the Carmelites are big on Mary. He went to the Church of the Carmelites in Paris, and he saw this, and he was absolutely appalled. He was shocked at this. He said, this is so misleading. People come into church. What do they think? Do they think that the Trinity was born from Mary, that it's even comparable, etc., etc.? So that's this potential danger is there, particularly because of the great attraction of her figure and this notion of sort of wanting to include her, and the Trinity itself being a very difficult concept. People are constantly finding the Trinity a very difficult concept, a very unwieldy concept. You put her inside Mary, it makes sort of sense. So yes, I would have thought that there are tensions here and potentialities here for issues to reassert themselves, particularly because now Mary is very popular in the Christian world of all communions. Even like the Anglican Church, Mary is, I think, a very strong presence right now. So one could see, as you say, a resurgence, at least amongst those who think theologically, of discomfort, as you described. Thank you very much. I wasn't aware of that.
Thank you. At the end, I should say, we are now in the land of Mary, Livonian, as now the Latvian and Estonian, in year 1215, was devoted to Mary and called Karalienas, and we are in the city where the cathedral is devoted for Virgin Mary. So Mary's, although we are basically a Protestant country, with large Catholic and Orthodox minorities, which are maybe now even majorities, Mary is still present here, although Protestantism has erased her quite a lot.
I just want to, since you say that, I just want to say a sentence about what you said, that the thing about a lecture like this is that what we know now, what we know from history about the meanings of these symbols, I think that's part of what European heritage needs to be.
So, Miri, I would say, on behalf of people of Karalienas, thank you for your great lecture. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.